Did you read The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway and wish it was only 76 pages long? Then you should read The Stranger by Albert Camus. Before we get to the review, we have to answer two questions. Did I enjoy reading this book? And the answer is yes. Will I ever reread The Stranger? And the answer also is yes. Welcome to Whiskey and Literature, where we read and discuss the greatest books of all time, the best stories that have ever been put to paper. And while we're turning those pages, we're sipping those bottles, those finely distilled spirits. I'm your host, Captain Mike. Last year in 2022, I watched a video, Benjamin McAvoy from Hardcore Literature, on the 50 greatest books of all time. And I decided to read all 50 of these books and added 2 for good measure to get the 52 books in 52 weeks. I decided to create this YouTube channel to share my experiences and reviews with you. This will be my 11th review of the year so far, The Stranger by Albert Camus. And before we get to the book, let's get to Albert. He was a French author and philosopher born in 1913. Died in a car accident in 1960. And while I say that he was a French citizen, he actually was born and lived in Algeria until 1940 when he moved to Paris. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1957, and he was active in the French resistance during World War II. And he was very politically active, and he opposed Stalin and the Soviet Union and communism in general. Okay, so this year, as I read about the books and the authors before I read the books, I've come a couple times across the philosophy of absurdism. And this author, he is one of these that has been associated with that. And I admit, I don't fully understand what absurdism means. I do understand that it's a philosophy regarding the absurdity of life, that life is meaningless. Honestly, when I read the book and then I was thinking about it, I was thinking existential nihilism, which maybe I kind of understand, but apparently this is different than existential nihilism, and Albert, he disavowed that he was an existentialist and a nihilist. And before we get to the book, we do have a quickie question to answer for the author. Would I like to sit down with Albert Camus and have a nice pour of whiskey and talk about life's meaning and purpose, or maybe the lack of meaning and the lack of purpose? And to be honest with you, I would love to sit down with him. I can only imagine that someone who lived through the occupation of France in World War II and who was active in the resistance, I can imagine how that shaped his thoughts and his philosophy, and I think he would be a great person to talk to. Okay, let's talk briefly about the specs and stats for this book. The Stranger was published originally in French in 1942. The original publication had 159 pages in it, though my copy only has 76, albeit very large pages. And Stuart Gilbert, he translated a copy of the book that I had. I also listened to small parts of it on Audible. I paid $8.52, and that was a different translator, Matthew Ward, and the narrator was Jonathan Davis. And he did a really nice job, even though it was kind of a flat and emotionless read, but I think that actually fits this book. Okay, enough about the specs and stats of the book. And before we get to kind of the characters and the plots, we're going to pause for a minute and do the whiskey of the week. And today we have the Elijah Craig Single Barrel 18-year-old whiskey, bourbon. So I bought this a couple of weeks ago. I paid $249 for this barrel of whiskey. I saw it on the shelf and I just couldn't quite pass it up. It is Elijah Craig's mash bill, 78% corn, 12% malted barley, and 10% rye. I think that's pretty standard throughout all the Elijah Craig products. I also bought a small batch, which is kind of like the average, the everyday Elijah Craig, $35. It's everywhere on every store. This is the only bottle of 18-year Elijah Craig that I've ever seen in a store. This is 90 proof, again, 18-year single barrel. So I actually poured a little bit of this for Mrs. Captain a few nights ago. I opened up the small batch Elijah Craig. That's 94 proof, $35. So, I mean, 8 times less than this whiskey. And she actually preferred the Elijah Craig small batch to the Elijah Craig 18-year single barrel. And I'm not really surprised. She's not big on the bourbons compared to the ryes. It is a slightly underwhelming bourbon, unfortunately. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying for $249, when she blinded it against the barrel proof and the small batch, she preferred those. But it is a bourbon. I do get some hints of some sweetness in there. Definitely a bit of oak, maybe some wood. It has been in the barrel for 18 years. I didn't pour very much. It is very sweet, very heavy on the oak. Again, it's been in the barrel for 18 years. It's got a high viscosity. Again, just kind of coats everything in there. But it doesn't have a lot of punch. It doesn't have a lot of, it's not very exciting. And I think anyone who comes to my house and I pour this for them, they would be happy. But it's actually, like I said, a fairly underwhelming bourbon. But anyway, Elijah Craig, single barrel, 18 year. Just buy the small batch instead. Let's get to the plot and the characters of the story. So the main character, his name is Meursault. He's a young adult. He's a French Algerian settler. I didn't really get an idea of to his age. Initially, I thought he was like a late teenager, but I think he's actually, I would say, early 20s. We have Meursault's mother, and a couple years prior to the beginning of the story, she was sent to an old folks home. We have Perez, and he is a guy at the old folks home, one of the live-ins there, and he actually got engaged as fiance to Meursault's mother. We have Marie, and she actually worked at the place where Meursault is a clerk, and it seemed like they didn't really have a relationship, but they met the day after the funeral when Meursault went back home. And they started a relationship that very next day, and they did it by going to a comedy at the movie theater. We meet Salamano. He's an old guy who lives in a building with Meursault, and he's got a mangy old dog, and he walks the dog on a regular basis and yells at and beats the dog. We have Raymond, and he is also a neighbor of Meursault. He might be a pimp, we're not sure. He's got an Arab girlfriend. Then we have Mason, who is a friend of Raymond's, who has a beach house. And then we have just the Arabs. None of the Arabs in the story are named. They are a friend of Raymond's mistress's brother. And anybody else who is an Arab in the story, they're not named. That just kind of creates some distance between the French Algerians and the natives. And then we have the Arab, and that would be Raymond's mistress's brother. And he's the one who later in the story is basically shot and killed by Meursault. So the book starts out with Meursault. He's at work and he learns of the death of his mother. And so he travels to go to the old folks home for the vigil and the funeral. And he never demonstrates, neither when he learns of the death during the vigil or during the funeral, or really any time afterwards, the grief that everyone around him expects him to demonstrate. Like I said, after the funeral, he travels home, he begins a relationship with Marie, and then the rest of that first book, we see into his daily life of his relationship with Marie, his boss, and his neighbors and friends. So Raymond, Meursault's neighbor, asked Meursault to write a letter to Raymond's girlfriend, so that inviting her over to his place because he wanted to have sex with her and then beat her up because he thought she was stepping out on him. And so Meursault does, and then she comes over and he has sex with her and he beats her crazily. The cops come, they stop the fight, take the girl away. Raymond is arrested or charged with a crime, and then he asked Meursault to testify that he's actually a good guy and that his mistress was stepping out on him, and that's why he beat her up. And so Meursault did that, and Raymond basically got away with beating up his girlfriend. So while this is going on, we see into Meursault's daily life, his interactions with Marie, his boss, and his girlfriend. So while all this is going on, and indeed throughout the entire novella, we catch glimpses into how Meursault only thinks about the now and the immediate future. For example, he's asked by his boss if he would like a promotion to move to Paris to help open a new branch that they were going to start. And he's also asked by Marie if he loves her. And he's also asked if they should get married. And he answers both his boss and Marie basically with the same indifference. Like, it doesn't matter to him. He doesn't have a preference. He's content with the way his life is. But if they want him to do it, he'll do it. Meursault and Marie get invited by Raymond to go to Mason's house for the weekend. So they're there and on the beach, and they see a couple of Arabs, and one of them is the brother of the girlfriend of Raymond's that he had beaten up. And so they have a small confrontation on the beach, and they beat up the Arabs, and then they leave. Raymond had a gun, and Meursault took the gun, or said, hey, let me hold your gun because you might do something rash. So he had it with him. So Raymond got pretty beat up too. So they went back and they found a doctor. And then Meursault was just walking along the beach, and it was hot and sunny, and he was thirsty, and it was so bright. And he comes across the brother, the Arab brother, and he's laying on a rock, and he walks up to him, and he pulls out a knife. And the knife is shiny and glinty in the sun. And the sun's beating down on him, and he's disoriented and maybe having heat stroke, and the sun glints off the knife and hits him in the face, and he's like, oh, bright, and so he pulls the gun out, shoots him, kills him, and he shoots him 4 more times. Then he's arrested, and that's the end of book 1. So part 2 is the jail time and the trial, and the time after the trial. So Meursault spends about a year in jail. First, Meursault is in jail, and he doesn't like it. He misses Marie, but then he just realizes he misses having sex with her, so he can just masturbate, and so that takes care of that for him. And then he goes through and he starts mentally listing the objects that were in his old apartment. And that's how he passes the time for an entire year. Each day he would just list the objects that were in his apartment, and that would occupy his whole day. And it just went by in a flash. And he never denies killing the Arab, and he does show a lack of regret for the killing. And so the prosecutor, instead of focusing on the crime, he focuses on Meursault's apparent lack of empathy and concern about anyone and everyone around him. So we get some play between Meursault and his attorney, and then the trial. And spoiler alert, he's convicted of murder, and he's not sentenced to life. He's sentenced to be decapitated, which, I'll be honest with you, if you were for capital punishment, I actually think the guillotine is a pretty legit way to go out. And while he's waiting for the sentence to be carried out, the chaplain repeatedly tries to visit Meursault, who says, no, I don't want to meet him, don't want to meet him. Until finally the chaplain just comes in one day, basically forces his way in there and confronts Meursault and has a conversation with him. They go back and forth about whether there's any meaning of life or any life after this life, until he's verbally accosted by Meursault. So to the chaplain, Meursault asserts that because he has confronted the certainty of death, he actually has a more accurate assessment of life and death and what's beyond than the chaplain has. He states that no matter what we do, we all face a certainty of death. And because of that, nothing we do actually really matters. And I didn't actually portray the verbal violence that was expressed in this exchange between the chaplain and Meursault. It was kind of a cathartic moment for Meursault, and he really never even thought about his mother or her situation. And he was always slightly confused about why she would get engaged. He realized that because she was staring death into the face as she was getting older and weaker in the old folks home, again, she thought, nothing matters. So I want to be happy, and to do so, I'm going to get married. So because of the moment with the chaplain, and then his insight or his understanding about his mother's condition, he was able at the end, and I'm going to use air quotes here, to open his heart to the benign indifference of the universe. And his last hope is that a large crowd comes to the execution and yells hate or execration at him, depending on which translation you have. And one of my translations has hate, and one has execration. What are my thoughts about what I just read? I have been in the habit this year to read about the books before I read the books. It has really helped me in my understanding, and the authors as well, because it has really helped me understand the books that I'm reading. When you're reading these books, it does really help to do a little prep work before you turn the first page. And I opened this book up, and it was over before I had a chance to look at Albert Camus' life or read about the novel. I opened the first page, and boom. Like any good book, you could just read it for the story that's in it. Just read it through. It's a nice story. Close it. go on to the next book. Or you could step it up a notch and try and get deeper into the book and see what is he trying to say. So I get that to fully understand The Stranger, you would need to deep dive Camus' life. And I just do not have time for that this year. So I enjoyed the story for what it is, while recognizing that there are deeper levels that I can just kind of faintly grasp. And I don't think it's a stretch to compare The Stranger to Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises. Hardly an adjective or descriptor in either text. Now, I did feel like in The Sun Also Rises, I was more present in this scene and I could see the characters, I could feel the emotions slightly more or quite a bit more than in The Stranger. But it had that same careless indifference of the characters, the monotonous drone of existence, drifting day to day, purposeless like a paper boat in a stream. This is a fairly easy read, or it can be. It's not appropriate for kids. I'm glad to have experienced it. And I'm looking forward to, as the years goes along, returning again and again to The Stranger and maybe getting different things out of the book as my thoughts and feelings and my personal philosophy changes throughout my years. Okay, guys, that's it for The Stranger. Next review coming up, we have Selected Stories of Anton Chekhov. And I don't know anything about this book. It's a collection of short stories, and he's Russian. Beyond that, it's an unknown to me. The review will be coming up in a week or so. I'm still working on the Jane Eyre review, and because I'm going to do that with a guest reviewer, and so once we get that schedules lined up and get that review done, the Jane Eyre will come out, and then the Anton Chekhov. So, guys, thanks for spending some time with me. I hope you're reading something good, drinking something good, turn those pages, and stay thirsty.